Okay, so first of all, thank you for coming to Hiroshima. I think there are very few of us actually from Hiroshima. Thank you for coming to listen to Yamada Sensei, and I happen to also be added on with Sensei. Okay, so my name is John McLean, and I work for Yasuda Women's University. And today I'm going to be talking about just start the slides today. Okay, so as you can see, the title of my presentation is the ISO 17100 Translation Workflow in your classroom. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about course design and course development, and I'm particularly focusing on the translation workflow part of the ISO 17100, not the actual standard itself in its entirety. Now, let me briefly explain about myself. Then I entered into translation or teaching translation starting from the professional world. I started off as a translator and spent a number of years working as a translator, translating from Japanese into English. And then after that as a translation project manager. And this was working with teams, English to Japanese and Japanese to English. And this has led into education now. So now at university I predominantly teach from English into Japanese translation. And my interest in this area of research is kind of underpinned by my professional experience. I've been teaching for close to 10 years now on the subject. So, and doing translation work, and I still do translation work for maybe 15, maybe more than that years. I've been in Japan for 20 years now, quite a long time. Okay, I'd like to apologize first of all because I'm a little bit tired today. Yesterday I went to Shimane with my students from my university. They're preparing for an orientation for the new first year students. Arrived back at my office 8 o'clock last night. I had a translation job to do, and some PowerPoint slides to prepare, and I slept in my office last night and just went home for a shower before coming here, so I'm a little bit tired at the moment. Anyway, let me begin. So, basically, today's presentation I'm going to be talking about three different things. So first of all, why do I think you should, I assume that we're all educated here, or most of us are educated here, why do I think you should consider using translation workflow in your classroom for your students? And basically focusing on the course objectives if you introduce this kind of course. Following that, how can you design a course based around professional translation workflow? And lastly, my current research interests, how can you actually plan the continual development, improvement of this kind of collaborative translation course? Okay, if I put it a little bit differently, I'm going to be talking about a grey zone that exists somewhere between education that we can offer at university and employment. And I think it's very important to recognize that this grey zone exists. Then after that, talk about the translation workflow. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on two aspects that I didn't think about in my work as a professional translator, but that I feel I cannot ignore as an educator, and that is conflict, and functional conflict and dysfunctional conflict, and the impact it has on learning experiences, on students' performance there. And so the course design is underpinned by social interdependence theory. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so as you can see. So yeah, a grey zone exists. If we think about translation education in Japan, then I wish my department were the Department of Translation and Interpreting. I wish it could be like it is in the UK where I'm from, that you can have students who already have the language skills and you can just focus on a number of years of teaching them how to apply those language skills to translation. But in reality that isn't the case. And my translation program at Yasuda, I'm kind of limited to 5 courses. And those 5 courses, the students can be guaranteed a place in the first of those 5 courses, but beyond that, there isn't much guarantee that they'll be accepted on the course or the timetable that they can actually take the course. Okay, so students who only have a small number of translation classes, when they graduate, many students say, I want to become a translator, I want to become an interpreter. And it's very hard to explain to them that, sorry, but our profession and university education don't match up so closely. They're not adjacent to one another. There's a big gap between the two. There's what I would say a grey zone. And the grey zone comprises professional translator competencies and valid translation experience. And you have to acquire these before you can really pursue a career as a professional translator. Okay, so first of all, I don't know if you've seen the ISO 17100. The rules about being able to show people this are quite strict, but basically they define if you want to participate in the certified translation process. Basically they define 6 categories of competencies that you require to be able to do that. And translation competence in this context is basically, can you write a semantically accurate translation that meets the client's needs and follows certain style sheet stipulations. Beyond that, if we're looking at source text and language source language and target language, you have to have linguistic contextual competence. So for example, if you're translating a contract, you have to have the competence to read, fully understand in, let's say, English, but you also have to have the competence to, the writing competence to actually write a contract in Japanese. Technical competence, I don't think it's too much of an issue, the kind of technology you require for many domains that I'm actually interested in, but PC competence is basically what the focus of that is. Domain competence, legal, if you're translating a legal text, then you have to have competence in the target language as well as the source language in those two. Cultural competence, the focus on the cultural competence is, are you aware of changes going on in that domain? Are you aware of changes, legal changes in Japanese, legal changes in English if you're dealing with legal texts? And research, information, acquisition, processing competence. Can you keep growing as a translator? Do you have those capabilities? Okay, and a kind of vague zone for translation, valid translation experience. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the other models that exist for translation competence, BB, Schaffner's EMT expert group. And basically they all comprise the same. The wording is slightly different, but the actual content of it is pretty much the same as you have here. However, there's on the next page, you notice I've added something at the top here. But something I'd like to bring your attention to is, you've probably heard the importance of domain competence. So this domain, if you're I keep using the word legal text. Actually, my background, I've done legal translation, I do legal translation, but my background isn't in legal translation. Domain competence, what is your domain? For me, my domain was, first of all, I went to university, studied mathematics. I went to graduate school, studied financial mathematics. I did research for trading banks. And then I trained as a management accountant. Then, following that, I studied Japanese. I passed level 1 Japanese, returned to university and studied about translation and Japanese language. Then I combined my domain competence of accounting and finance to start a career in translation by translating financial documents and research papers that are very highly scientific. Okay, but domain competence, something on the ISO that they stress is domain competence is important for all of these other skills. But not only that, if you look at, I pulled up on the Japan Translators Federation website, there are 150 translation service providers advertised, and 16 of them were advertising for jobs between December and a couple of days ago. And of those 16, 15 insisted you must have a minimum of 1 year domain competence if you want to apply for this job. You must have, most of them were talking about having 3 to 5 years to apply for this job. And there was only one place that said, we will consider you if you don't have domain competence, but you're competing with professional translators for that job. So when you see this, actually myself as a translation project manager, I wouldn't employ anybody who didn't have enough domain competence, because they would just be making me busy. I would insist, I do insist, that anyone who I work with has a solid background and language skills, a solid domain competence and language skills go together. Okay, so this is the grey zone that exists between graduation and employment. And this is the reality. When students say, I want a job, then I have to say to them, well, you've got to acquire this before you can reasonably get a job. You're looking at between 1 and 5 years before you can really get a stable kind of job. Okay, if you have a look at the EMT, Foxes, Gottfrieds, that's probably mispronunciation, Kelly and Packard from Barcelona University, if you look at their definitions of translation competence, they add one more here. They add interpersonal competence. It's not on the ISO one. It's not on the ISO one, but it is on the ones that have emerged from the academic world of translation. And I think this is a key point. This is something that I think is important for educators to focus on. If I give you just a little example of what kind of thing it includes. So when they talk about interpersonal competence, they're talking about knowing the standards, what it is, the standards, the process, the workflow that you need to work to be able to create a professional translation. And knowing, more importantly, knowing how to work in a team. Okay, now, so if we look at our students, what opportunities do they have when they're graduating? Well, they can go on to do a second cycle degree, a master's. In Japan, we don't currently, is that correct? We don't currently have masters in translation and interpreting. Possibly coming soon, but I don't think we actually have something just yet. That would be one place where they would acquire skills, but I'll be completely honest, I still wouldn't employ someone directly out of university, even if they had a master's in it, unless I could be sure they had some kind of hands-on experience, some kind of domain competence. Okay, so most of our students, if they go to graduate school, they have the chance to study a few more translation classes, in maybe part of the language, literature, or education course. Education in Japan, I think it's quite clear that a number of the translation service providers, they have courses available for students to take. And if you do really well on those courses, maybe we'll employ you at the end of them. By really well, we're talking like you have to score like more than 95% throughout the course to have any guarantee of employment. Personal opinion is that translation service providers are very good at putting money into their own pockets and using students as a way of doing it. Okay. Employment. You could get a job at a translation service provider if you're extremely lucky, straight out of university. They maybe train you. Employment in the education, finance, manufacturing, medical, legal, travel, tourism, blah, 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 industries. Now, these industries, you can develop domain competence. And also, you can have, if you have good English skills, the opportunity to participate in in-house translation projects. Okay, last one, volunteer translation projects. I've joined some TED projects, and I realize it takes a lot of time, and I don't get any money for it, and very little thanks for it. But these options are available to our students. Okay, now if I focus on my university and the realistic destinations of my students, English department students, 95% of them go into regular employment, or what we consider regular employment in Japan, in finance, medical, manufacturing, legal offices, as teachers, and so on. And my students, generally, those who take my Zemi, tend to have a minimum of like 700 TOEIC score, up to 920 TOEIC score. So I have about 10 students who do have a very good level of English when they're graduating, but they're not really going into, it's not enough just to have English to get them jobs as translators. But you notice there are some students from our university who do go straight into the translation jobs, and this tends to be manual translation, computer manual translation, and the students generally have like 2 to 3 years of training before they're able to lead a translation project rather than just playing a peripheral role in a project. Okay, so taking this into consideration, what I think is worth considering is look at where our students go after they graduate. We want them to get into the field or be able to join the professional field of translation in the future. And 95% of them are actually gaining target language, domain competence. Let's say my student is working in a legal office. She has excellent English. She's developing domain competence about how to write a contract, the technical competence of how it's put together. So the target competences, she'll be aware of changes happening in the legal field of Japan. And she'll be quite clear of what the clients expect, because she's putting together a contract with lawyers, she's helping them to compile it. So she's becoming aware of client requirements, she's becoming aware of the purpose of that. What is the purpose of producing a contract or whatever. Okay, so they're actually acquiring a large proportion of the skills they need to become translators in the jobs that they're already going into. So what do I think we as educators can do? I think that we can focus on interpersonal skills, strategic skills, research, information, acquisition, processing skills, competencies. Why? Because from having these skills, if we teach them how to do this, we're basically giving them strategies to make use of their working environment, to make use of the language they're learning in Japanese, and to carry out research to be able to acquire the same skills in English. And interpersonal skills, we're teaching them how they can work with experts around them to be able to translate like an expert. Okay, so basically these can facilitate the other competencies, is what I'd like to propose. So, as an objective for university, this is just one possible objective, but looking at my students, I think this is the most realizable objective. As an objective for them, to facilitate their development of strategic and interpersonal competencies required for them to operationalize a translation workflow in their future working environments. I actually break down, based on research, what I mean by strategic competence. Okay. Anyway, strategic competence. In your own time, if you can read this, my eyes are failing me. It's just a blur. And this is what I mean by interpersonal competence. I think if you're looking at the interpersonal competences, then the EMT expert group gives the most comprehensive definition of what those competences are. Okay, so let me get to the crux of what I really want to talk about. So, those competencies, what are those competencies we want them to strategy. The strategy we want them to have is a strategy to apply a professional translation workflow in their working environments. First of all, they need to know what it is and to experience using it. So, pre-translation activities, translation, bilingual check, 1 or 2 bilingual checks, monolingual checks. Final verification is basically checking that all of these procedures were followed correctly, and feedback to the client afterwards to make sure the service is what they expect of them. If you look at it like this, it's actually very simple. Translation, bilingual check, monolingual check. Pre-translation activities are to facilitate these three phases so that you can do them better. And this isn't new. Even though the ISO 17100 only came out this year, I have the EN 15038 as well. It's the same. The translation workflow is the same. And in fact, I was looking at translation procedures 400 years ago in the UK when the Bible was translated. And it's really not so different. They maybe didn't do the best job when they were translating the Bible from Latin into English, but a team of 56 people was split into smaller groups. They each translated a part of the Bible into English. They then exchanged and did bilingual checks of one another's. And then following this, they exchanged again. They did monolingual checks of each other's translations. Okay, so this approach certainly isn't new. Recently, I was reading about Ranald McDonald. Do you know the first American who kind of came into Japan at the end of the Edo period? And he, in his diaries, was talking about translation in Japan. And official translation in Japan at that point, anything that was officially done had a minimum of 2 checks. So these procedures have been used for hundreds of years in Japan as well, so certainly nothing new. Okay, so this is what the ISO 17100 and the EN 15038 is basically talking about. What kind of things can you do in your pre-translation phase? Analyze the content, the source text, prepare a style guide, check terminology, decide who the audience for it is, and the purpose, the scope of the actual translation. With this one, the translation and first checking phase is done by the same person. So you translate, and then you will check your translation against the style guide, against what you've set up beforehand. And then the revision. Revision is a bilingual check done by a second person. So another person will be checking with the style guide and will be also checking your appropriate use of terminology, phraseology, whether or not you've missed anything, whether or not your punctuation is appropriate, and so on. And then this is basically copy editing. If you have a look at copy editing books, then this is basically what goes on here. They split it into 2 phases, so substantive and like proofreading, copy editing. Okay, now the elephant in the translation workflow. This, for a number of years, I've been ignoring this, thinking I can get really good data from my classroom. I can get really good data that will show that this translation workflow is a great thing to use in your classroom. And unfortunately, I couldn't get good data. And the reason why I couldn't get good data is that I kept coming up with the same thing. Of course, the more phases you have, of course the translation will improve. The more people that check it, the better it gets. That's obvious. But what I kept returning to is that whenever groups of students with, let's say, 300, 400 TOEIC score work well together, have good team dynamics, then their translation can be better than those students whose scores are 700, 800 that have poor dynamics, that don't work well together. And I realized that I can't keep ignoring this. This is like the biggest impacting factor on the quality of the translation, definitely in the classroom. And then I was thinking about myself as a professional translator. What impact does it have on me? What kind of conflict am I experiencing when I'm working with other people? Well, let's imagine I'm working with my wife and I hand it to her. She's brutal. She will just say, error, mistranslation, omission, inappropriate phraseology. Then she'll go one more step and say, you're an idiot. I can't believe you're capable of doing this job. I tried to say something in return and realized the best thing I could say is, but so for me, this kind of conflict does actually impact my working environment. And it's natural. It's natural that whenever we come to a translation and you're collaborating with someone else, you don't just have one goal. When I'm working with my wife, it's easy for us to focus on the one goal of producing a good translation, and we can put aside the arguments. But when I'm working with other people, then we definitely come with different objectives and different goals. And so of course we want a good translation, but we want to be better than the other person. And someone finding your errors, someone pointing out your weak points, it hurts. And just think of any working environment. If you send your research paper to a journal and it comes back with red ink everywhere, it really hurts and it can demoralize you. And this is something we as translators collaborating with other people have to tolerate. It's necessary for us to actually improve our product. But it can also, when someone insults you, then you can go from a phase of cooperation to feel like you're competing. I want to show you that I'm better than you. I want to insult you. It's very easy to just lose sight of the main objective that the two of you have. Okay, so basically I'll read from the big screen, I can see that. Basically there are two types of conflict that I think that we should focus on in our field. Functional conflict, we need this. Conflict that will comments politely put, constructively put, that can lead to us improving a translation. Differences of opinion are essential for us. Okay, but then we have, then we have dysfunctional conflict. This is when that conflict goes beyond the point when it's useful. And it goes beyond the point where it impedes on our agency. It impedes on our willingness to actually do the translation. I remember about 15 years ago I sent a research paper to a mathematics journal, and the first two people who gave me feedback were kind of nice to me, and the third person insulted me so badly, every single sentence. It took me a year to recover. And I thought, I am never again going to send a paper to a mathematics journal. Mathematics is finished. I'm going to just focus on my learning for a few years and develop as a translator. And so it can affect your agency, your willingness and ability to act, to work, to do your job. Okay. The common things, number of studies have actually shown that it can cause stress, burnout, absenteeism. And from the field of translation, then symmetry of commitments. So you lose sight of your original goal, which is to produce the best possible translation for the customer. Okay, so here are the two from the field of translation. There isn't that much research in the field of translation on this subject. Okay, so if we have a look at the research that's currently available, there's a lot of research that says when you're designing a course, collaborative translation course, there's a lot of research that says there's a need for more research about how to design collaborative translation courses. And unfortunately, it's still very limited because I think a lot of research we're focusing on the processes. So, for example, we pick up a single phase and focusing on single phase of the translation process. That doesn't equip you with skills that our students need to transcend that grey zone. They need to know all of the phases together. Or it focuses on cognitive, the cognitive nature of translators. So a lot of the stuff that I've seen that's come out of Spain, the research, is like, what does a translator think when they're translating? How can you replicate what professional translators are doing in their head when you're translating? How can we bring that into the classroom? And that collaborative thinking, that strategic knowledge, it's okay, it has a place, it's necessary, but it doesn't really address the needs of our students unless we are tying it in with a way of handling the omnipresence, it's everywhere, of conflict in the translation workflow. Okay, so for research in this field to continue, then we definitely have to think, first of all, three things: course objectives, as I said before. How can we facilitate our students with strategic and interpersonal competencies that they can use to set up in-house translation workflows in their future working environments? We need to think, how can the translation workflow be applied to the classroom so that they can learn about it in detail? the domain, the length, the function, the audience of it, the number of phases in the process, the type of team you put students in, what's your role as an instructor, and the guidelines we give them during each phase. And lastly, we cannot forget conflict management. We have to think, how can we promote functional conflict? What can we do to mitigate those instances of dysfunctional conflict? Otherwise, you're going to spend, like I have the last 5 years, feeling like I'm going around in circles and just ignoring the major player in it. Okay. Probably going to have to start jumping some of the handouts, some of the PowerPoint slides I have here. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about course design now. So the objectives, I think you understand what I believe the objectives should be. The design of the course. So first, as I said, you need to think about how can I apply the translation workflow. These are the core decisions we're going to make. And first of all, then we have to think in the future working environments, they will have an opportunity to develop domain competence. So we don't really want to focus too much on that. But what this means is, what kind of text can we bring into our classrooms that students already have domain competence in? And it's quite limited. Correspondence, emails, they have maybe domain competence in this. They know they can read and understand emails, they can write, I hope, emails in Japanese. Manuals, recipes, it's such a very simple form of writing in English, simple form of writing in Japanese. But these two areas, linguistically, they're very, very limited. And I kind of feel like there's not very much that students are really learning in terms of research and further acquisition of language by using these two. I've tried them on my courses. And that's why I started using folktales. And I use folktales because you've got Momoko, you've got Kinpo. Students can be a critical reader of folktales. They can read a folktale and say, that's not interesting, that doesn't sound good, the language just doesn't appeal to me. They have an opinion about it. They don't necessarily have an opinion about a contract, they just, well, maybe it's okay. But folktale, they do have an opinion about it, and they can judge its quality. Okay. And linguistically, I like to use folktales that were written like 100 years ago. There's debate about using literature or non-literature text in the classroom, but I like using the folktales written in England 100 years ago because there's a lot of old language or Scottish language that's used in them, and for me it's understanding that. It's like the terminology in a contract. You've got lexical items which you have to do a little bit of research about to understand better. Okay, let me continue. Okay, now, so once you've decided on your text, the next thing you have to decide is how many phases to actually incorporate into your process in the classroom. Pre-translation phase, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But translation checking, I always get my students to do this individually first. They translate and check. Okay. Translation checking, they do this first. Then, I don't believe that my students really check their translations. They say they check them before submitting them, but I don't really believe that. For this reason, I get them to then come together with their individual translations. They've already spent maybe 2 or 3 hours working on the individual translations. Come together in a group of 2 or 3 and produce one team translation based on that. Okay, so, and once again, checking it. So this second translation are basically confirming their own understanding of the original text with their classmates, reducing the number of errors. Okay, then they should check it, and once you get to the next stage, the revision stage, then this is where I get them to write a formal critique of other students' translations. And then they have to respond to that critique of why they made certain decisions in their translations, hence the collaborative part. Then finally, I focus on the 2 proofreading sections. So I try to include every section, but I also duplicate these 2 just to ensure the students really are checking their own translations. Okay, now the role of the teacher comes in here. Now basically, we want to produce students who are, let's see, actively engaged in their learning with the future prospect of becoming self-directed. We want them to distance themselves from us. We don't want it to be teacher-centered. We want them to go from relying on us, on teachers, to knowing how to work with their classmates, with their peers in the future. Because there won't be a teacher telling them once they leave university how to do this. So we have to start moving them away. And so I focus on my role as right here. Here. This is the role that I play. After they produce their revisions of other students' translations, after they've picked up as many of the errors as they can, then I pick up as many errors as that I can find that they've overlooked, that they've misunderstood from the original text. And that way, when they're polishing it, when they're improving it in these final two stages, the quality, they're not polishing errors, they're polishing something that is semantically accurate. And this I bring their attention to the errors that, after all these phases, they still overlooked a number of key points in their translation. Okay, so I'm going to rush through the coming slides, otherwise there won't be much time for discussion. Okay, source text analysis. There's a lot of discussion about what to include this in the pre-translation phases and how detailed analysis, how thorough should your analysis of the source text be. I usually give the first 4 weeks to pre-translation activities, and then after the first 4 weeks I focus on the translation process and try to repeat it as many times as possible. And in their analyses, I think the objective is for them to identify textual features relevant to the process that they do later. So not, in discourse analysis there's a lot of approaches that are extremely detailed about how to analyze a text, but you can lose sight of your real objective, which is your analysis is to make sure you can do good translation, not to become a professional linguist. You're analyzing it to make sure that you've understood the original text thoroughly. Okay, then, so I basically get them to focus on, can you identify the purpose, the scopus, who's the audience for it, or I'll set the audience for them. And I get them to focus on key lexical, terminological, grammatical, stylistic features, peculiarities. That I can give them a long list of like 50 or so, and find any of those which they find particularly, they need particular attention. So for example, if you're doing literature, then maybe the use of the metaphor, the use of similes, this kind of thing. Okay, and style guides, then I get my students to create a style guide. And by doing this, I get them to look at translations which have already been done. So if they're translating literature, then I get them to find literature that's already been translated. And they'll look at these features they identified here. And it's like, so how is it a simile is translated into Japanese? How is the metaphor translated into Japanese? How are these features put into Japanese? And for a key target audience. Oh dear, brilliant. Okay. When you come to the monolingual check, then I tend to use this kind of book as referencing for what kind of things they should be looking for. In English, when I'm working myself with Butcher's or the Butcher's copy editing or the Economist style guide are very good when you're translating into English about what kind of things to be checking for to make sure it's suitable for a target audience. Okay, so if you have a look if we come down here, of particular interest is, for example, what can you add, what can you omit? You can often omit the subject in Japanese when it's present there in English. And they should have identified these when they were actually doing the original research in the previous phase. Again, in the final phase, they're looking at kanji, spelling errors if it's English, appropriate use of kanji for the kind of punctuation. If they're writing for a young audience, they're using the appropriate level of kanji, typographical errors, format, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Let me just jump on now. Okay, so, conflict management. So this is, I think we can all, as educators, think how to use, how to apply a professional process to our classroom. I think we can probably all use it slightly differently based on our own experience of what we think should go in each phase. But to deal with conflict, then I've had to look at the field of education for ideas of what they can actually do to reduce conflict, reduce dysfunctional conflict. And one area that I'm particularly interested in pursuing further is social interdependence theory. And positive interdependence mean that you both have the same goals. You win-win or lose-lose. It's not a competition. And to try and add these extra elements to your translation process, there's a lot of research corroborating these different elements. Okay, promotive interaction is basically functional, what I've referred to up to now as functional conflict. Individual accountability, social, blah, blah, blah. Let's go to the next phase. Yes, 45 minutes. Okay. So, what do I add to the translation process to realize each of these? I'll pull them up here. First of all, positive interdependence. Then emphasize for the students that they cannot complete the translation without the cooperation of the other students. They can't do it by themselves. It has to be done together. A portion of their grade is based on that collaborative work. Individual accountability actually give a higher proportion of their grade based on what they do as individuals and their individual critique of other translations, their individual translation in the first place, just to make sure that they're arriving at the group work having done their fair share of work that they must do to participate in it. Social skills, I give them a set of tenets for how they should actually behave with one another. So for example, in their group work they must agree on how each lexical, grammatical, stylistic features are translated. This is from Communities of Practice, mutual engagement. They must all play an active role during every phase of the translation in their teams, joint enterprises. They must all share linguistic resources, so if they find an online dictionary that's particularly useful, they must share it with their classmates. They must be committed to both their own learning, their team learning, and they have to actively question and reflect on the product and process of the translation. Now, looks great. This is what I've been doing for the last 5-6 years. It doesn't work. This isn't. I'm not poo-pooing my research, I'm saying just telling them how they should behave does not work. And if you've heard me present in the past, I've been focusing on action learning. And action learning is learning that replicates a working environment. And this is the kind of thing it stipulates, the way they should integrate with one another. But just telling them you must do this, it really doesn't have much of an impact. It's just like saying to my son who's 4 years old, you have to sit like this when you're at the table. You must stay sitting here at the table. He doesn't do it. 2 minutes he's sitting like this, then he's sitting like this, he's running away from the table. And it's bad to compare my students to my 4-year-old son, but just telling a person to do something isn't the best way, or isn't the most effective way of doing it. Additional measures, this is what I've realized. To achieve this objective, I have to take additional measures. You must add additional measures, otherwise you're just going to think, why isn't it working? And this first part, I'm not 100% convinced by it, but written protocols, if you haven't used them, then I recommend checking out what written protocols are. There are a number of written protocols. This is a cognitive branch of translation studies. And this is how can we replicate the way translators think in the classroom. And I'll show you a slide of what a written protocol is in the next one. And most important, this is probably the one thing that really does have an impact, and that is intervention. And this is something that in Japan students are particularly good at doing. That means what I do is I get the students to do the translation cycle 2 times, and then they stop and they say, what should I be doing at this phase? What should I be doing at this phase? What do I expect you to do? Hanseikai. Basically something that's always been part of Japanese business, Japanese way of doing things. But having it after 2 cycles, then they complete the 3rd cycle. And you can see improvements there. Okay, so here's an example of a simplified written protocol. His job was as a hamburger taster. And so this is a regional analysis. Says, okay, we've got the use of a job name or something like this. And Lee McLean is a place name. Okay, and this is the technique that the student identified with their analysis of the research. Now, probably you're thinking, あんまり良くないそれ。低集合バーガー。So it's a play on words. Play on words is what the student actually trying to do. It may not be a great translation, but they noticed other translators played with words for doing this, and they were confident that this was a good translation. And this is kind of terminology that they found looking at terminological approaches to it. Okay, so they'd write a translation they're confident with in this phase, in this column, and one they're not so sure about in this column. This means when they come together to talk to one another and to make the translations together, already they've admitted, this isn't so good. This actually needs improvement. What do you recommend? They're not coming and saying, this is the best, and the partner saying, this is the best. They're coming, admitting their weaknesses, and looking for help from the other person. And this is a very good crux to use for discussions. Okay, role analysis, like I explained to you before, this is an example of what I get them to do. It's kind of like handshake. What's the purpose of your learning to participate in translation workflow? Let's come down. What do you expect, want from other members of your translation team? And open discussion among them about what they can each do better. Okay, I'll keep course development down to 5 minutes, and then so course development, this is my research now. So basically, once I've got my course in place, I want to think, how can I keep developing it? And I think the best way to take this research forward, because it hasn't been done in our field, is to first of all understand what type of conflict our students are experiencing. Intergroup, intragroup, within that group, is it relationship conflict, is it task conflict, is it process, meaning how much each person is contributing, intergroup, and intrapersonal, inside of themselves, what kind of conflict are they having with the approach that I'm making them follow in the course, what kind of strategies are they using to deal with that conflict, and what impact that conflict is actually having on their performance. Okay, so to assess the various measures that have been introduced to increase functional conflict and reduce dysfunctional conflict. Okay, now I've got like 3 or 4 pages of useful data sources. Oh, I think I've wrong order. Okay, the approach that I personally think is worth using for this research is action research approach. And an action research approach is a cycle, meaning it's kind of never ending. I can't expect to get great results from next year, but what I can expect is to get ideas how to keep improving the course over a number of years, and to just keep identifying weaknesses. So making hypotheses before the course starts, research questions before the course starts. Mid-course I'm observing their behavior, making more hypotheses about how to improve the course further. Okay, so if you're familiar with action research, then you'll be aware that it's not a one-step research. I'm doing research to improve my practice, and from my practice, I do more research to further improve my practice, so it's a cycling process. Okay, then, I've got a long list of useful data sources. I've tried to use most of these, actually, and in your own time, these are the inventories that have been tried and tested in many other fields of research, but we haven't used them. This is for identifying and categorizing instances of conflict. I think there needs to be some kind of triangulation, so your observation and these inventories. Useful data sources for identifying conflict management approaches. I'm actually looking at Rahim at the moment. Are they confronting one another, smoothing, avoiding, forcing, compromising? If you have do a quick Google search, it'll explain to you the different approaches that people are using for these. Okay, let's see. Assessing their understanding of the workflow, then basically I focus on questionnaires to do this. Okay, I better finish that because I'm going way over time. Thank you very much.
それではちょうど時間通りに終わりたいと思いますので、だいたい10分間ぐらいをめどに、いろいろ ろいろディスカッションお願いして、それから5分休憩して、次の発表ということで、45分まで一応時間を区切らせていただきたいと思います。
Thank you. I didn't think I'd have time for questions. Good, 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 good. 質問なら英語でも日本語でも構いませんけど、一応イギリスの大学の同僚の先生がこっちを見て批評したいということで、それで最初の話をすると英語でやりました。今から日本語でも全然大丈夫です。
どうぞ。
優しい。ちょっと情報がすごい多いような気がしますので、私から見ると、はい。
My name is Nara from Competences Studies. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I want to know the ideal group size in class environment. In your case, how to decide?
Yeah. Actually, because
Do
I
you consider the level of the students?
the group size, I don't actually consider the level of the English when thinking about the group size. Originally, I worked within the theoretical framework of action learning. Action learning, action research, I mustn't confuse the two. Action learning. So, and the guidelines for action learning is basically set on a professional environment, and you have between 4 and 8 members in the team. And for years I was trying this, and I realized there were members who weren't doing anything in those teams, no matter what actions they took. And I stepped back and I thought, why am I modeling on a theory when, first and foremost, I need to be modeling on the way I do my job as a professional translator. And first of all, collaboration with one extra person, so groups of 2 or 3 is what I now focus on, because if I'm setting up a translation process, if I have more than 3 people, it becomes a little bit of a monetary issue. 2 people, there may be a lack of understanding about how to improve it. But basically, in the future environment, I don't want students to think, if I'm doing an in-house translation, I need to have a team of 8 people working with me. I want them to realize, no, push yourself. 2 people. The other person has different skills to you, maybe better first language skills or better foreign language skills. The 2 of you can learn a lot from one another. And one thing that I've been doing recently is dropping it down to 2. And the revision is like a 3rd person in the team. And I kind of feel like I'm the project manager, so a core team of 2 people with one person who's like semi-employed on the outside, just fulfills a small task.
Thanks very much. I find this really interesting. Lots of ideas from my own class, a lot of issues that I find similar as well. I wonder if you could just put the whole of this presentation into the context of, you say you have 5 classes.
Yeah.
Is this related to, for example, your 7 to 1 class, or is it spread?
Yeah, I actually see this as something that I need to introduce in the first of those 5 classes. And then I have a lot of students who take the teaching certificate, and it always seems to clash. They tend to be the best students as well. It always seems to clash with the translation class just because of timetabling issues. And so many students who want to take the course can't take the 2nd or the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th course. And so I position this in the first course, and I think this is the basic knowledge that they need to, they may not use it, but this is the basic knowledge that they'll use parts of in the future courses. And I allow the ones that follow that to focus on other skills, so maybe looking at subtitling, and there'll be an element of teamwork, but I don't expect to have to tell them. I'll ask them, how are you going to work together? I'll ask them to make those decisions themselves. But yeah, I try to focus this on the first course because that's the only one I can really guarantee to get them. And then my Zemi, I have no idea how my university decides who goes to what Zemi. It's certainly not by the Zemis that they choose, but those students are the ones that I can take to the farthest points. But yeah, unfortunately, they can't be guaranteed to get into my Zemi, even if I wanted to.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. And I'm interested in your course design and class design of the translation classes. And you have now six steps for one translation cycle.
Yeah.
How many cycles do you have in your course?
Good question. Generally speaking, I try to fit in 3 cycles. I set my students 2 homeworks during the week. So for example, if they have a lesson on Monday, I'll give them until Wednesday to send me or my graduate assistant their group translation, let's say. And then I put together the group translation, I'll send them to other students. And those other students have until the night before the following lesson to finish their written revision of that groups. So basically, for one lesson, I set 2 homeworks a week. And then when they come to the following lesson, their group's translation has been critiqued by another team, and they have things they can do on their own. I don't want them to do that in the classroom. Things that they need to be together for, I want them to do that in the classroom. So I set a lot of work in to be done outside of the classroom. Generally, 2 deadlines per week. But this is something that you may have noticed that last summer vacation, I made a course available for anybody in Japan, university students who are interested in experiencing the translation process. And at university we usually have 15 lessons to work with, but I worked with, I think maybe like 24 lessons, and over a 5-day period of intensive study. I could also specify minimum TOEIC scores, so it was quite good. But yeah, I think that we should also consider not just our classes, but also if we care about preparing students for the future working environments to become translators in the future, maybe we can all focus on what skills we have that we can offer to all university students in Japan. For me, it's focusing on the collaboration point. Maybe for another sensei, it'd be focusing on the technical aspects of translation that you could make available to all university students.
How are your students' reactions? And also, how do you grade?
Yeah, that's a good point, grading. Grading is extremely difficult. Grading, the students are never 100% sure about how I grade them. But they know their grade will be 60% based on their individual participation and 40% based on their group participation. And at the end of the day, when I'm looking at some groups who, for example, didn't improve, the number of errors that they make actually increases rather than decreases, then I can't say you are bad students, because I'm already recognizing this is conflict, which I haven't managed to control in the classroom. Compromising is one of the conflicts. That's like an internal conflict. I don't like this deadline. I don't like the work you're setting me. It's not in line with my own objectives. So I'm going to compromise by trying to persuade my teammates to also, let's just, cheat. Let's meet out of the classroom. Let's copy from one another. And this is an aspect which I recognize is part of conflict strategy. And it tells me that the processes, the approach I'm using it doesn't tell me they're bad students, it tells me the approach I'm using still needs to be improved. So yeah, basically the number of assignments they do is the safest way. As long as they submit all of the assignments, then they can actually get a grade A, of course. But they refer to me as Oni after this course. Yeah, 2 assignments each week seems to be quite a lot for them. Okay, can I just conclude by saying that I really hope that we can all recognize that there is this grey zone, and that from now on, I think there needs to be a lot of research about different approaches. I'm just offering one approach to actually transcend this grey zone and bring together education and employment. And I think it can benefit the professional field as well as our educational field. So, anyway, thank you.
ありがとうございました。ちょうど時間ぴったりですので、5分間聞いてみましょう。